Smuts is welcomed by Prime Minister Winston Churchill into the Imperial War Cabinet, and in 1941 promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. He wins the respect of Allied leaders in the West. Churchill especially holds him in high esteem, even wanting to appoint him as acting Prime Minister of Britain while he is away in Tehran. When looking out over a field of dead soldiers, we have a glimpse of the sensitive Smuts.
Even though these were the faces and sufferings of our enemy, one had a deeper sense of the common humanity which knows no racial distinctions.
Smuts may have been a brilliant military strategist, but he was no warmonger. He viewed war as a means to an end in the interests of nation building. Thousands gather in Johannesburg to hear Smuts' peace speech and call for a new world order.
A world order in which a new human society can arise within the framework of an organized international peace order.
But in a changing world which now upholds the fundamental rights of the United Nations Freedom Charter, of which he himself had drafted the preamble, there is severe criticism of his domestic policy in which the majority are still disenfranchised.
They were diminished. Imperialism died with World War II. And Smuts somehow didn't realize that was happening with all his intellect, all his understanding of politics, all his understanding of reconciliatory politics. It just didn't register with him. Didn't register with Churchill either. You know, Churchill thought, that the empire was going to continue for 1,000 years. Smuts just failed to read the key moment of his time.
Here is the author of the great preamble of the Charter, exposed as a hypocrite and a double-faced time server. They are, of course, right, and so is dear South Africa. But look at this bad fellow who is responsible for it all.
The tragedy of Smuts is that he was a man of enormous intellect. Few like him. I mean, he has to be one of the giants of history in terms of the range of specialities that he engaged in, and was recognized as such by all sorts of people, from Einstein and other great men, certainly Churchill did. But the pre-World War II world did not recognize people who were not white Westerners. Somehow they were behind in terms of civilization. That was what World War II changed. And the sad thing is, Smuts should have known it. World War II, in his own words, and those of Churchill, was against racism. Hitler was the ultimate racist, exterminating the Jews. World War II was the war that made the world realize that racism was no longer sustainable. When the time came in 1948 and he was defeated, this was a huge blow, a shock. And this man, Milan, who had been, in our minds, pro-Nazi, I think he'd become so embroiled in global politics that he lost sight of what was happening on his own home patch. He thought that he still had the Afrikaner vote. He just took it for granted.
Ismail, Smuts' deputy prime minister.
He was a liberal to the heart, and he openly said there's only one solution for South Africa's racial problems, and that would be one man, one vote. And to say that in the 40s was a terrible thing to do. And I think that also played a huge role in people saying, no, Smuts is not young anymore. Jannie Hofmeyr is now 53 or 54, so he might well become the next prime minister, and then we're down the drains.
For the Afrikaners to change and accept one person, one vote meant giving up their country. as they saw it. And I had to deal with this as a political correspondent and as a commentator that was opposing it. But I had to understand why it was so difficult. And why in the end I believe they could never do it unless an Afrikaner told them they had to.
The Afrikaners were further concerned about being overwhelmed by blacks coming into white areas.
South Africa had really undergone an industrial revolution through the war. Black people had swarmed into town. The black issue had become big. They'd taken a lot of the jobs that the departed soldiers had taken, and they were rubbing shoulders up against Afrikaners who'd left the rural areas, left their farms to come into town to accept jobs as the Industrial Revolution expanded and urbanization had taken place. South Africa changed, as indeed the world had changed, and he didn't notice the change.
But perhaps one of the greatest flaws in this man of genius that led to him losing the election was ironically his very intellect. He did not easily take advice from others.
He couldn't really entertain other opinions. He was a man of his own kind and he believed in himself.
Smuts is totally crushed at losing the 1948 election. The grand dream of a prosperous, liberal and united South Africa that he had envisaged has come to naught.
Smuts did not prepare South Africa for the change that ultimately South Africa would have to make.
Instead of being an instrument of change towards democracy for all within his own country, he has paid service to Afrikaner nationalism and European imperialism, neither of which proved to be compatible.
Apartheid was a new thing. It was a new thing, was a strong thing, and in the end, not because of Smuts' dealing, but of the Afrikaners themselves, who believed they were a Heron folk and the only people that could survive on this earth. With leaders like Malan, Straderman, especially, of course, Verwoerd. They became a people upon themselves, and they believed that they will forever, like Ian Smith, for the next 1,000 years. And this was entrenched in 1956 by Advocate J.G. Straydom, Prime Minister, who said in Parliament, there's no question about it. Die wit man is baas in South Africa. The white man is boss in South Africa. No other ways about that. And people applauded him. They applauded him for that.
It took an Afrikaner in the shape of P.W. Botha to first say we have to adapt or die. And that is why it's so disappointing that Smuts, the Afrikaner genius, didn't recognize it.
But Smuts did recognize that transformation was inevitable, and although he himself did very little to facilitate it.
My feeling is that strong forces are at work which will transform the Afrikaner attitudes to the natives.
At the opening of the Voortrekker Monument a year before his death, he made an appeal to the Afrikaner community to embrace reconciliation in race and color relations.
On the top of the Andes Mountains of South America, there rises a monumental cross called the Christ of the Andes. May this monument of our historic beginnings be a symbol of the same kind. The Christ in Africa. A symbol not only of past strife, of the blood and tears, but also of our reconciliation and eternal peace, and of our view to pursue in our race and color relations as well, the just, the good, and the beautiful.
Smuts dies in 1950, heralding in a 40-year period of apartheid, one in which racial and cultural divisions are entrenched, with the population being legally categorized into 4 boxes: whites, coloreds, Indians and blacks. A move which militated against any form of nation building.